Well, welcome everyone to this final Islands Matter webinar for this semester. We've had speakers from quite far afield in the past. Just looking back, we've had Prince Edward Island, the Faroe Islands, the Isle of Man. But today we're not going so far afield. We're looking much closer to home, and I'm very pleased that we have Dr Marc Chivers with us today, who's based in Shetland and is a friend of mine. I was very lucky to be one of his supervisors on his PhD, which he has now very successfully converted into a beautiful book on the traditional Shetland boat. And I should say, Mark and I are rowing partners as well. We've been exploring some of the islands around Shetland and hope to do a little bit more of that this summer. So if you have questions for Mark, which I'm sure you will have, if you put them initially in the chat, and then I'll sort of look at them as we go along. And once Mark has said all he wants to say, then there'll be the opportunity for asking him questions. And just to show, there's Mark, I have it. I'm enjoying reading it. So put your questions in chat, and we might open up the actual sound, maybe allow you to ask your question as well at the end. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Mark. Hello, Mark.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for inviting me along, Andrew. This is great. So basically, I thought I'd begin by just talking a bit about the background to the book. I moved to Shetland with my partner back in, wife now actually, back in 2013. Prior to moving to Shetland, we lived in Devon, just outside Dartmouth in Devon. And I was working for a wooden boat builder called Ashley Butler of Butler and Company, traditional wooden boats. And we lived on a 42-foot cruising yacht, which didn't really go anywhere. It was just pretty much moored against the quay there at Old Mill Creek. And then saw an email advertising a funded PhD, which I kind of applied, and Ray, my wife, she kind of smirked and said, okay, that'll be fine. And then Andrew actually offered me the place. So that was it really. And we moved to Shetland in September 2013. We live on the island of Burgh, which is about 12 miles from Lerwick. And so I began the PhD, I think it was in September, October of 2013, and finished it in 2017. And the book has just been published a couple of months ago and is available from the Shetland Times. Get a plug in there. So before we move on, I thought I'd show you some of the boats that we'll be looking at this afternoon. Basically, you can break down boats in Shetland into two broad categories, and that's four-oared boats and six-oared boats. And although they're referred to by the number of oars that they used, so a four-oared boat in Shetland is called a four-ream, and a six-oared boat is called a six-a-ream. And there are some generic or subgenre boats within those broad four- and six-oared boat categories. They predominantly sailed as well. So as you can see, the top two photos, the top left-hand photo, black and white photos of a six-a-ream. The boat there is called Industry, and that's under sail in about 1880 at a place called Walls, which is on the west coast of Shetland. And then the boat next to it, the other black and white photograph with the three people in the boat, is also a six-oared boat, but that's a Dunrossness Yole, which is a slightly different boat shape to the six-a-ream. And the Yole probably is the closest relative to the original boats that were imported from Norway, which we're going to talk about a bit later on. I don't know if you can spot, there's an odd one out in the bottom photograph there on the left-hand side. There's a white and grey boat, and that's not a Shetland boat at all. That's actually the restored lifeboat from the Oceanic, which was the sister ship to the Titanic. So basically, when I began the PhD, I, of course, looked at the literature to see what other people had written about boats in Shetland. And basically, the overwhelming opinion was that the boats in Shetland were of Norse descent. And this seemed to be an author-led self-fulfilling prophecy. So originally, back in 1884, a chap called Charles Rampini, who was the deputy sheriff of Orkney and Shetland, gave a speech in Edinburgh. And during the speech, he said, "These Sixons, which like the Fair Isle skiff, the Orkney yawl, and the Ferroween fishing boat were lineal descendants of the land skip of Viking times and were perfect in the eyes of the islanders." So he made that statement in 1884. And then in 1914, Robert Stuart Bruce, who was an antiquarian in Shetland, who lived in Edinburgh for a great part of his life, wrote a paper for a publication called the Mariner's Mirror, which is the academic journal for the Society for Nautical Research. And basically, Robert Stuart Bruce said, the Sixon was a small version of the Norse longship. And from that time on, pretty much every author has echoed those 2 points, really. So that was one of the biggest overwhelming things that hit me when I first started the PhD. Secondly, the import of boats and boards from Norway was not particularly well understood. And in recent times, thanks to IKEA, they were being referred to as flat pack boats. And as a boat builder, I thought that was a bit suspect. So I thought that warranted a bit more investigation. So we'll talk a bit about that this afternoon as well. And also, the third point was generally people believe that boat building in Shetland began between 1807 and 1814 as a consequence of the blockade of Norwegian ports by the British Navy, which is a blockade during the Danish War, which was part of the Napoleonic Wars of the 18th and 19th century. So that 7-year blockade basically stopped allegedly timber coming to Shetland and also boats. So we'll have a quick look at that as well. And also the focus of previous authors had been on boats used for commercial fishing, and that kind of had missed the great part of what boats were used really in Shetland, which was subsistence use, and we'll look at that as well. Okay, so moving on. So from the literature review, there came some questions. So were there any traces of Norse boat building tradition found in the boats that currently exist today? How did the boat trade between Shetland and Norway function? And were boats and boards simply kits? When did the boat trade in Norway end? And when did vernacular boat building begin in Shetland? So there are the main 5 questions that I posed during my PhD. In terms of evidence, so there was quite a bit of evidence to draw from, really, and that was material evidence, so the boats themselves and things associated with the boats. There's a collection in the Unst boat haven, a very good collection there, and that's if you visit Shetland, that's well worth a visit. Going up to Unst to see the boat collection of the Unst boat haven. And also the Shetland Museum and Archives has a really good collection of Shetland boats as well. And as well as that, there are people in Shetland have boats. You come across boats in sheds quite often. And there was one particular boat I came across which was quite important, which is now actually owned by the museum. As well as material evidence, there's linguistic evidence. So I'm not sure if you're aware, but originally Shetlanders spoke Norn, which is a form of Old Norse, and that died out in the 18th century. So there was linguistic evidence to draw upon, and there's a a chap called Jacob Jakobsen, who came to Shetland in the late 19th century and published, I think it was 1928, an etymology of Shetland dialect. And then there's documentary evidence from the archives, which we're going to look at a bit this afternoon, oral history, and historic images. So the museum and archives has a really good photographic collection that goes back to the 1880s when photography first began to be used in Shetland. So that was really useful resource as well. For those who aren't familiar with Shetland and where Shetland lies, Shetland, as you can see, lies sort of halfway equidistant between Bergen and Faroe Islands and Scotland. So you could almost see Shetland as a bit of a hub, really. And you know, the Shetland has been inhabited for about 6,000 years. The Norse moved to Shetland in the 9th century. And you can see probably why the Norse came to Shetland. We're going to look at that a bit more in a bit more detail in just a minute. As well as Shetland's proximity to Norway, Faroe and Scotland, it's worth pointing out that Shetland also traded with Hamburg and Bremen, with the Hanseatic merchants that came to Shetland from the 15th century through to the very early 18th century. And also that's quite an important trade route between Hamburg, Shetland and Shetland, Bergen. So it's a bit of a triangular route trade. So Shetland is an archipelago of approximately 100 islands. And being an archipelago, to get to Shetland in the first place, you would need a boat. So the first travellers that moved to Shetland 6,000 years ago would have had to travel here by boat. And once you arrive in Shetland, you would need a boat to get around. Roads actually didn't come to Shetland until quite late. Road building began in the 1840s as part of famine relief. Prior to that, there were no major roads. There were some tracks, but people needed to get around by boat. So boat was crucial for everyday existence. And in fact, you can think of the boat really as the modern family car. That's kind of how the boat was used. So the importance of the boat. This is a photograph of a print from a book called The Market Boat by Barnard in 1890. And basically this boat is travelling from the island of Bressa to Lerwick to market. And as you can see, the boat is laden with all sorts of things, from livestock through to other goods. And it's interesting to note that there are no men in the boat. There are women taking the boat across to Lerwick. And it's quite interesting to note that back in the 19th century, visitors to Shetland, who were generally male and middle class, noticed often that when they arrived, they were surprised to see women rowing boats and doing subsistence fishing in Lerwick harbour. And this is commented on numerous times. Basically, that's because during the summer months, the men were away at sea fishing, commercial fishing. So boats were used for flitting cattle to the Isles for summer grazing. As I said, going to market, flitting home the peats. So you'd go to your peat bank, which you'd go to probably by boat. You'd cast your peats, and then you'll be going back during a couple of months to help them dry, to keep turning them. And then you'll go and collect them and bring them back by boat. Then going to the shop, moving general cargo, going to church, visiting family and friends for subsistence fishing, commercial fishing, for ferrying. So quite often travellers in particular, would want to be taken from place to place, and they would negotiate a fee for you to take them there, and also latterly for recreation. So as I said a bit earlier on, the Norse came to Shetland. There's archaeological evidence of the Norse first coming to Shetland around about 850 CE. The photograph is of a ship which is in the National Maritime Museum of Oslo, at the Viking Ship Museum in Bygdøy, which is the Goxstar ship. And this ship was actually found in Goxstar Sandefjord, Goxstar farm in 1879 by two brothers who decided to dig. There's a big mound there, and the mound was locally known as the Kingshaugen, or the King's Mound. And there'd been a myth passed down through time that this was the burial of a great king. So one day, two brothers decided to have a bit of a prod around in the mound, and they found the bow of a ship. And happily, news got round very fast, and a chap called Nikolai Nicholson, who was president of the Society for the Preservation of Ancient Norwegian Monuments, came and excavated the ship with a team of archaeologists, and then transported the ship and the finds that were found with the ship to Oslo. The ship was built around 890 CE, and it measures 78 feet, that's 23.8 meters long, with a beam of 16.7 feet, that's 5.10 meters. The Goxstar ship is basically a multi-purpose vessel. So it was, it could be used for raiding, but it was also used for transporting cargo. And it could be this type of ship that the West Norwegians first came to Shetland in. Found along with the burial furniture of the Goxstar ship were some small boats. So basically, the ship was buried. There was a cabin built on top of the boat, and I don't know if you can see in the left-hand side of this photograph, there's some timbers looking like the pitch of a roof. Well, that's part of the cabin that the person who was buried with the ship was placed within. And part of the burial furniture were these two boats. The small one nearest the cabin structure is a four-oared boat called a faring, and the larger boat is a six-oared boat called a seaworthy. As well as these two boats, there was a third boat, and that was broken beyond reconstruction, and that was thought to be an eight-oared boat. So these, the four-oared boat and the six-oared boat, would have been the types of boats that were used during the 9th century in Shetland. So the Norse would have come in their big ships. They would have brought their smaller ships with them. A point to mention, which I've not mentioned just yet, is that Shetland has no trees really. So there was no timber for the Norse to use on their arrival in Shetland to build anything with. So houses generally are built of stone, but boats which you would need to get around Shetland in would need to be repaired. And so the timber would have to come from Norway. And this is the beginning of the timber and boat trade with Norway. This began probably in the 9th century, and this trade continued right through until the 19th century. So, as I was saying, the Norse would have been going to and from Norway once they were here to get supplies for timber and for boats. And they would have used ships like this. This is a ship called Sifega, which was constructed in 1990, and it's a full-scale replica of a coastal carrier called Skudelev 3, which is found in Roskilde Fjord, and is part of the Roskilde collection of boats. This boat is an 11th century boat built in Denmark. So it would have been these kind of boats that people would have been trading to regularly, which we're going to talk a bit about shortly. So this ancient trading relationship with Norway is probably exemplified really by a fjord that leads into Bergen called Hjeltefjorden. Now, Hjeltland is the Old Norse name for Shetland. Hjelte, I believe, means the hilt of the sword. So the fact that there was a fjord named after Hjeltland, after Shetland, means that Shetlanders were going there for a very long time. And in fact, the first documented evidence of Shetlanders trading in Norway was made in 1186 by King Sverre, who denounced German wine traders from Rhineland in favour of, "We thank all Englishmen because they came here, those who brought wheat, honey, flour, and cloth. And we further thank all those who have brought linen and flax, wax and kettles. And we also mention amicably those who have come from the Orkney or Shetland or Faroe Islands or Iceland." So that's King Sverre's extract from King Sverre's speech of 1186. So Orkney and Shetland were part of the Norway and Danish kingdoms up until 1472. And basically, King Christian I of Denmark had a daughter, Margaret, who he wanted to marry to King James III of Scotland. Unfortunately, at this period, during this period, King Christian, Denmark was fairly bankrupted, and that's because Denmark had been fighting quite a few wars with the Hanseatic League. And as a consequence, Denmark was fairly poor. So King Christian arranged with King James to actually pawn Orkney and then Shetland. And this was never redeemed. And so Orkney and Shetland became part of Scotland in 1472. And then a bit later on, in the 16th century, Shetland formed an important part of the Scottish timber trade. And this was vital to Scotland because by the 16th century, Scotland had a powerful presence in Shetland, but still boats and timber continued to be imported from Norway. So with Scotland's increasing dominance to Shetland, why was this timber and boat trade still centred in Norway? The answer is fairly straightforward. Scotland had used up all its easily accessible resources and was itself importing Norwegian timber on a much larger scale than Shetland and Orkney. Scotland's large timber import trade was called Skottahandelen by the Norwegians. It was founded on the Scottish Parliament's declaration in 1503 that as a result of building a navy, Scotland's woods were utterly destroyed. During this period, Scotland had an enviable reputation for shipbuilding, which, the Scottish historian Christopher Smout informs us, had been eroded to such an extent by the time of the Act of Union in 1707 that the Scots were buying their ships from overseas, from places such as Norway and Holland. The Scots during the 16th century saw the timber trade with Norway and the Baltic as essential to the development of Scotland's economy, and Norway was referred to as the storekeeper of her, Scotland's, naval supplies. In 1562, the Danish and Norwegian government, which was keen to protect its own resources for its own navy, placed restrictions on timber exports. And so, in the following year, the Scottish ambassador was sent to Denmark to negotiate the restoration of the right of Scottish merchants to purchase timber from that country. The importance of this timber trade is shown by the fact that in 1573, a statute banning the export of Scottish salt was waived for those who were trading with Norway for timber. And then, in 1663, a ban on the export of bullion was introduced, but trading in timber was also exempted from this ban. So as you can see, timber was really, really important. It's interesting to note that during this period, Scotland was also importing some boats from Norway, but it was importing far more timber. And in terms of Shetland, Shetland was importing boats on a much larger scale than Scotland, as well as importing timber. So the boat trade with Norway, between Shetland and Norway, was as important as accessing timber, and it was lesser so for Scotland. Excuse me. You might also be wondering, Scotland has lots of forests, but you have to remember it's all very well and good having lots of trees, but if they're in places that aren't accessible, then you're not going to be able to get those trees very easily. Most trade during that period went by sea, so you'd want trees to be near water so you could transport them easily. And that's why Norway was favoured, of course, because of its fjord systems, and with a forest that went almost down to the shores of the fjords. So you could get trees to the coast very, very easily and then export them. The Norwegians also had a thing called the water saw mill, which made converting tree trunks into boards very, very easy. And so that was another key factor. During this period, there was a chap called Andrew Murt who had moved to Shetland from mainland Scotland at some point in the 16th century. And after the death of his first wife, Ursula Tulloch, around 1587, obtained from the Scottish king a license to join himself in marriage with any parties, whoever he shall find agreeable to him within the town of Bergen in Norway, or elsewhere within the bounds of that said country. Murt at this time, it seems, was a regular visitor to Norway, and it is believed that he was heavily involved in the profitable Scottish-Norwegian timber trade. During this period, mainland Scotland exported grain, flour, bread, cloth, fish, spirit, and tobacco to Norway in exchange for timber and a few boats. Andrew Murt moved to Norway around 1590, whereupon he married Elsa Tronsdottir, a noblewoman. They settled in a principality called Tysnes, and it was their son Axel Murt who later became the largest land and property owner in Western Norway. And Axel Murt formed the barony Rosendal, and as far as I'm aware, that's the only barony in Norway, or was the only barony in Norway. Axel Murt played a key role in the Scottish-Norwegian timber trade, and it is probable that the Shetland timber and export boat trading link explains why Tysnes in the 17th century became the specialist exporting district of boats to Shetland. So it's interesting to note that during my research, it became evident that Shetlanders were involved in a great deal of smuggling. This is not unusual in the 18th century. Certainly where I moved from in Devon, that was 18th century smuggling's rife as it was in Cornwall and most other port towns around the UK during that period. The customs accounts in Shetland begin in 1742. Unfortunately, these are incomplete. And in 1745, there was only one ship recorded in the customs accounts as importing goods from Norway. This ship belonged to Thomas Gifford and was called Sibella, and it sailed to Lerwick on the 10th of September, having travelled from Guyasund. I should say that Thomas Gifford was an exceptionally wealthy person, and he was one of the main administrators in Shetland during this period. Again, no boats or boat-related items were listed in the cargo of Sibella. Just spars, barrel hoops, birch bark, and what they call timber ramble, which is just assortment of timber, basically. This entry in the customs accounts is noteworthy when it's compared with an account of cash disbursed in purchasing our cargo at Norway. This document was addressed to Thomas Gifford and written 1 month earlier in August by William Farquhar from on board, who was the skipper of the Sabella. And it's possible that the 10th of September entry in the customs accounts relates to Farquhar's August voyage, but surprisingly, the cargoes appear to be quite different. In Farquhar's invoice to Gifford, boats and oars are listed, but there is no mention of the 2,000 barrel hoops entered in the customs accounts. This suggests that Farquhar's August account of the cash disbursed relates to a different voyage, which may have been possible provided the weather was favourable. He did not sail via Hamburg, and that the Norwegian cargo could be got ready and loaded quickly. Even if 2 crossings did take place, and the September cargo related to a second trip, this then begs the question of why the first voyage's cargo was not entered into the customs accounts. Whichever way this is viewed, it's clear that the correct payment of duty on this cargo was successfully avoided, either by fraudulently entering the cargo in the customs accounts on the 10th of September, or alternatively, if this invoice related to an earlier voyage, the first cargo managed to avoid HM customs altogether. The simple fact of the matter is that the cargo was smuggled. It seems quite interesting to note that where possible, duty was avoided to be paid in Shetland. Things were smuggled, but generally duties were paid in Norway. Export duties were paid in Norway, and import duties to Shetland were avoided wherever possible. So, what other proof do we have of how the boats were smuggled? During the early part of the 19th century, there was a steep increase in boat imports, suggesting that the deep sea, that's the half fishery, was undergoing a period of expansion, and further evidence for this growth in the fishing industry was provided in a document titled Instructions. This document was unsigned and undated. Shetland archivist Brian Smith analysed the writing of this document and he attributed it to James Hay. In Hay's set of instructions is a section regarding changes to currency in Norway, and neither Brian nor myself understood this. So Brian contacted Ingvar Nederabo, who is an archivist in Bergen, and he dated this document to around 1815. This letter confirmed that boats were being entered as other timber articles in order to reduce their taxable value. An intriguing point is that there was no mention of a cargo for the Hays in the customs accounts for 1815, and those for 1816 are lost, so there's no way of determining how this cargo was actually entered into the accounts. Indeed, there's no mention of James Hay and Son in the customs accounts until the 30th of March 1818, and in that cargo there's no mention of boats in boards, just 4 upset boats listed. Upset means boats that are ready built, and basically those were small boats that were stored on the deck of the importing ship, and quite often they take the frames out and then you could stack the boats one inside the other on the deck of the ship. The Hay family, it seems, built their fortune from smuggling boats and other goods. So from this letter of instructions, you can see here how they were actually smuggled. The duty on manufactured timber at that point was very high, and so you'd want to try and list your items as not manufactured timber. So I'm just picking on something out of this list here actually that would be quite useful to look at. Yes, so spars. So a spar, we often think of spars as being masts or yards. That's how we refer to masts and yards today. We call them spars, but actually a spar could just be the trunk of a tree. And generally spars entered into accounts mean literally that, the trunk of a tree. So spars over and above the number that comprehend the boat's keels and gunwales may ship 10 dozen 14L trees that run from 21 to 22 feet, as many of them may be or indeed should all exceed 4 inch in diameter, may ship 5 dozen or 2/4 spars not exceeding 6 inches in diameter. So, sorry, gone back one. So this just lists how the boats were smuggled. So if you imagine boats and boards, so what we're going to talk about in a minute, the so-called boat kits, actually were components, boat components, and you ship them as other items in the ship's cargo, and that way you avoided paying customs duties. So boat kits. I suppose to begin with, there was a Danish report about the Diocese of Bergen, written on the 12th of June in 1714, in which it was stated that all boats being exported from Gujesund in Tusnes were only clinked together with a few nails, and before taken on board the ship, they are numbered and marked and then taken apart again. And when the ships arrive at their place of destination, they are discharged and put together again in accordance with the before mentioned numbers and marks. Thus, a ship's hold can carry 70, 80, 100, even 120 boats. And this report, this quote, appeared in an article written by a chap called Towson in 1969. And from that moment on, really, the term boat kits have been used in relation to the boat import train from Norway. Now, at first, this might seem quite reasonable, but you have to consider that the idea of building a boat and then to number and mark, disassemble, ship, and then reassemble it in Shetland might appear straightforward. And I suppose we're so conditioned to flat pack furniture these days, we just kind of automatically link to that notion. I think it would be quite easy to do. First thing I should mention really is that a boat, unlike flat pack furniture, which generally is square and flat, as the name suggests, boats are not flat. They are basically one big compound curve, curving in every direction with not one straight edge anywhere on the boat. So that automatically makes things a bit more complicated. And it has to be remembered that boats were built by different builders, and all the parts of boats were hand fashioned using simple hand tools, as illustrated here. In Western Norway, boats were built pretty much by axe, and actually the traditional boats in Western Norway are still built in pretty much the same manner. Modern tools are used, but a lot of the work is done with the aid of an axe, which we'll look at in a minute. So these boats are built by individual builders using wood, which behaves slightly differently. You know, you think you're cutting out a piece of wood and it's going to behave in a certain way, and then you're surprised when it doesn't. Wood is a living material, and when you cut it from a plank, the shape will change. The tension built into the trunk of the tree, once you start cutting it, that tension's released, and the board will start to take on a different shape to the one you actually intended it to take on. And all parts of these boats were hand fashioned using simple hand tools. such as axes, knives, adzes, augers, and planes. Each boat, therefore, was unique. It was bespoke. It would have been imperative that all the pieces of the same boat remain together, otherwise reassembly would not be possible, as the bespoke parts would not fit another boat of the same size, even one built by the same builder. So Townsend's source states that boats were only clinked together with a few nails. At first glance, this sounds feasible, but how were these clinked nails removed without damaging or destroying the strakes? Clinked, has to be remembered, means riveted. First, an iron nail was hammered from the outside of the boat through a pre-bored hole of the exact size. An ironed diamond-shaped flat washer was then forced onto the end of the nail. That's called a rove. The nail was then trimmed to project roughly about 1/16 to 1/18 of an inch, so it's 1.5 to 3 millimeters above the rove. The rivet was then formed by the boat builder using two hammers, one to rest against the head of the nail on the outside of the boat, and the other to hit the trimmed end of the nail to form a very tight rivet. And this process is called clinking, which relates to the sound that it makes when you knock the two hammers together. It makes a clinking noise. So to take a brand new boat apart would be a laborious process involving removing hand-forged iron rivets. So the hand-forged nails themselves were really expensive. It all seems rather improbable. The high risk of damaging the strakes, the whole thing makes no economic sense to destroy perfectly good new hand-forged fastenings and potentially damage the boat you're trying to transport and sell. The other point to make about this Danish source is that the quantity of 70 to 120 boats being shipped allegedly to Shetland, this I'm afraid is nonsense. The ships operating in Shetland in the 18th century were in fact small, between 40 to 60 feet, that's 12 to 18 meters long, by comparison to ships elsewhere, which means that a single shipment of 120 boats was improbable. In fact, 100 years later, the largest quantity of boats recorded in a single shipment was 72. A more practical solution was to roughly pre-cut the pieces and then bundle them together for construction in Shetland. And we have evidence of this from the Thomas Mowat records. Thomas Mowat kept meticulous records, and these are housed in the Gardy House archive on Bressa, which is a private archive maintained by Thomas Mowat's distant relative, John Scott. So it was seen from these records that it took 2 weeks to assemble a boat in boards. And from the evidence, it's clear that they weren't simple reconstruction kits. There's other evidence as well of warehouses. A Hayne company had a warehouse near Hayes Dock in Lerwick, and that housed boat components. And I suppose in the 18th and 19th century, 2 weeks to build a boat from boards is pretty good going, really. And that might be termed as being quick. To us, that would appear quite slow, and when we relate it to our IKEA flat pack furniture, which actually, if some of the parts are missing in your flat pack furniture, it could take 2 weeks to assemble. The other important thing to consider is that if you rough cut your component parts in Norway, you're actually saving a lot of space on your ship, which you could use to transport other goods. So when you build a boat, basically, you could think that probably a third to 2/3 of the timber that you're using is being wasted because you're cutting out shape boards from bits of tree and all the other bits that go to make a boat. You're actually wasting quite a lot of wood. So to have all the bits pre-cut out for you in Norway saves the boat carpenter in Shetland time, because they don't have to do that when the timber arrives in Shetland. and it also creates more space for you to import other stuff on the ship. So as I mentioned, boats shaped by axe. So the top right hand photograph is a piece of boat. It's the board that is at the front of the boat or at the back of the boat. So on Norwegian boats and Shetland boats, there were 3 boards that made up a strake. So you had the bit at the front. In Norwegian, that's called the fram hals. I can't remember what it's called. The middle part's called in Norwegian, and in Norwegian, the back bit's called the bakhals. In Shetland, it would be the front halsen. The slot would be the middle board, and the backhalsen would be the back bit of the board. And when the 3 were joined together, that forms the strake or plank of the boat. As you can see, the twist that's been put into this halsen strake is done by axe. So I don't know if I've got a photo actually. No, I haven't. That's a bit of a miss. I thought I had a photo of a friend of mine actually making a house. So you start with a large piece of wood, and then you end up carving it, and you end up with this delicate curved strake called the house. So in Norway, they traditionally still cut these strakes by axe, by hand. In Shetland, there's no evidence of this being done by modern boat builders. We tend to use steam, as elsewhere in the UK, really, to shape timber. So to steam timber, basically in the old days, they used to soak the piece of wood in a stream for a few days, and then they'd light a fire, make a fire, and then gently heat the strake over the fire to soften the wood fibers. And then once the wood fibers were sufficiently softened, they were twisted into shape and clamped onto the boat, left overnight for the wood fibers to harden again. And then the next day you could final fit the board and then fasten it in place. The Norwegians would argue that actually hand carving the boards, these shaped boards, that gives the boat its important shape for either sailing or rowing. And it's important to emphasize that these curves are really, really important. They determine how the boat is going to perform. You can actually have better control over boat shape by carving them by hand with an axe rather than steaming them. But that's just opinion, really. So the Norwegian boats we're talking about, and these would have been the boats that Shetland were importing right up until the 19th century. The evidence for the boat import trade stops around about 1872. That's when the import trade died completely. It waned for a long period before then. I suppose the evidence that I found during the PhD was that boat building or boat imports are being modified from about 1880. Sorry, from about 1780, 1780 onwards. And there's some evidence, couldn't find absolute concrete evidence, but I'm sure that boat building was going on in Shetland before then. And even in 1730, there were boat building boards being imported to Shetland, but that was the only evidence I could find. So we're using the date from about 1780 when boat building began to happen in Shetland. So up until that point, the boats used would have been very similar, if not identical, to the one in the picture here. And this is an Osava boat, which comes from Western Norway, from just outside Bergen, from around the Bjørnafjorden area. These boats, you can see this boat here is rigged with what's called a spritsail rig. There is some evidence from the 19th century fishing boat registers that began in 1869 of spritsail boats, but predominantly in Shetland it was the asymmetric dipping log sail that was used, or prior to that the square sail. In Norway, the square sail went out of favour in the 19th century in Western Norway, and the spritsail became widely adopted. Some other interesting points about this boat really is that the rudder and the helm of Norwegian boats are quite different to those in Shetland. I suppose the rudder shape is similar, but the way that the rudder is actually fixed to the back of the boat is different. And also the way the boat is steered is different. The helm or the tiller, as you can see here, you've got this piece coming out the top of the rudder. I don't know if you can see my cursor on the screen. And then you've got the tiller extension. And there's like two metal links at the end where the tiller joins the bit, the tenon coming out of the head of the rudder, which mean that you can rotate the tiller in pretty much any direction. In Shetland, this wasn't the case. The tiller actually fitted on top of the rudder stock rather than to the side. The other interesting point to notice in this painting is the coffin shaped, or the wooden thing at the back of the boat. This is called a fish coffin. I can't remember what it's called in Norwegian. And basically, you'd catch your fish, and then you would put them in the fish coffin, and you can see there's some holes in it. You would put this in over the back of the boat, attached to the boat, obviously by a line, and it would sink just below the surface. And this meant that you could keep the fish alive until you got to market. That's just a particular West Norwegian thing. I've not come across that anywhere else. Yeah. So by about 1880, these Norwegian boats are made from 3 or 4 strakes, and by the late 18th century in Shetland, an extra strake was being added, and it's assumed that this extra strake was being added to enable the boats to sail better, and that coincides with the development of the commercial fishery, the half fishery, which is a summer fishery that began around about May and continued up until the middle to or end of August, depending on the weather, where the 6-oared boats would go off fishing for ling and cod using long lines set on the bottom on the seabed. So as that fishery developed, the boats began to change shape, and that's when Shetland began to build their own boats, really. And I suppose when the Danish War began and the blockade of Norwegian ports happened between 1807 and 1814, that was a major impetus for boat building to expand in Shetland. And after the lifting of the blockade, probably the death knell for the Norwegian trade was the fact that the boat builders in Norway had to increase the price of their boats. And timber duty also increased. So timber import duty increased. So basically the boats were costing twice as much to build and import as they were prior to 1807. And so it became cheaper for Shetlanders to start to build their own boats. And this kind of knocks on the head the idea that the boat import trade was because the Shetlanders wanted purely Viking type ships on the boats. That's not the case at all. It was just a pure economic matter. While it was cheap and convenient to import boats from Norway, they did. And as soon as it became uneconomic and not quite so convenient, it stopped. So I said the end of the boat trade happened in 1872, really. And there was a letter from Hay and Company to the merchants in Bergen, written in 1872, basically saying that Shetland was now importing timber from other parts of Norway, from eastern Norway, and they were buying timber at a cheaper price, and they were building boats in Shetland. And it's interesting to note this photograph here, taken around about 1885, is of a Norwegian ship in Lerwick harbour unloading timber, which is a complete change around from Shetlanders going to Norway and bringing timber and boats back themselves. So it just illustrates the change in the trading relationship with Norway. Norway was now coming to Shetland rather than Shetland going to Norway. So I suppose we could look at elements of boat building that you can still see in boats in Shetland today. And the easiest one to spot is this thing called the snick, which is a moulded bead. In Western Norway, traditionally each strake on West Norwegian boats has this snick or moulded bead. And this can be traced back to the 9th century. And in fact, this photograph here is of the sex ring that I showed you earlier on, found within the Goxstar ship burial. And you can see a moulded bead on these boards. The boat and the top left-hand photo is of a boat that was built around about 1880 in Shetland by a boat builder called John Lawrenson, who is from Nesting, which is on the east side of Shetland, not that far from Lerwick. And you can see the beading on these strakes. This boat is actually the one I talked about earlier on, which is now part of the Shetland Museum collection. And this boat belonged to a boat builder and crofter and fiddle maker called Tommy Isbister, who lives on the adjoining island to Borough where I live, called Trondra. And Tommy acquired this boat about 40 years ago, I think. And I saw it hanging up in his shed. He had retired the boat because it was so old and so original. Pretty much every strake on the boat is original. All the fastenings are original. So this is actually quite an important boat because it's got some interesting boat building details, such as the snick on every strake, and another detail which is which I won't talk about now because it's going to confuse you. But I can ask if you've got any questions about it. I can ask me at the end, and I'll talk to you about it. The tool to make these mouldings, the snick, is this thing called the snick hurvel. Hurvel in Norwegian just means plane, basically. So this one belonged to Jack Schoen, who was a well-known boat builder in the late 19th century. The top left-hand photo is of an Osava boat that was being built when I was in Norway in 2014. It was being built at the Osava Varkstaden in the Principality of Us. And the boat on the right is a boat built by Tommy Isbister. And you can note that it's got the same moulding on each strake. So you can see that the boats actually have this Norse tradition that's been handed down that's still being used. And another point, how are we doing for time actually? Crikey. Another point is that the snick basically always used to be thought as being decorative in Shetland and meaningless. But a boat builder friend of mine in Norway said actually the snick's really important because it enabled the strakes to flex very slightly where they were joined. Not sure if how true this is, but they were saying Western Norway they wanted a boat that was flexible, and they'd rather have a boat that took a bit of water and was flexible and to have a stiff boat. And basically that's because working in a stiff boat in the sea when you're fishing for a long time becomes very tiring, whereas a flexible boat, it's more gentle. And the fishermen used to test the flexibility of a boat by shaking one of the stem horns and seeing if the other one moved. And if it did, that was a good boat, which is kind of counterintuitive because from my boat building tradition, you wanted boats to be as stiff as possible. So yeah, it's just a different approach. In Shetland, recreation became quite a big thing in the 1890s. So people began to have a bit more in the way of spare time and also a bit more of a disposable income. And so regattas began, and this photograph is of an early Lerwick regatta. Lerwick, I think the first Lerwick regatta was 1880. And this is of two women's rowing teams at the Lerwick regatta in around about 1890. And it's interesting to note the boats they're rowing as four-oared boats, but the boats are actually six-oared boats. I think they're yawls. Another photograph here from around about 1900 of the tub race. I just wanted to show you this because it shows how popular the regatta was and the fact that people were actually spectating from on board boats as well as along the quay. So regattas were a huge event and continues to be a huge event in Shetland up until about the 1980s when they kind of died, which we'll look at in just a minute, reasons for that. So boats began to change in shape as their use began to change and became more recreational. As you can see from these two boats here, they're both four-oared boats, but they've got things like stern sheets, the seats at the back, and other fancy bits. And they've got these two on each of the seats going across the boat. We call thwarts, or in Shetland they're called tafts. They've got things called knees, the curved bits that strengthen them, that you wouldn't have on a traditional Shetland boat. And also the framing has changed slightly as well. You've got these steam timbers or steam frames being put in as well. And this photograph kind of illustrates the change in way of life. Instead of taking your boat by sea to wherever you're going, you're transporting your boat by car. So this is a great photo from about 1938 of this chap transporting his boat on top of his Model T Ford truck. So Duncan Sanderson, who came from a boat building family. His family owned a boat building business on Unst called Sanderson's, funny enough. Began a class of racing boat called the Maid. And in this photograph, you can see this is the first photo of a Maid, and it's Duncan's Maid. It's Duncan in the boat there in yellow with the pink sail and the green boat. That was a Maid. And basically it was just a small four-oared boat that Duncan wanted to sail with his wife. And it became very, very popular, basically because it won races. And so lots of other people began to build Maids in Shetland. And the class kind of grew until the 1980s. The Maid then started to develop a bit further and become more of a purebred racing machine, and the class rules began to change more frequently, which allowed boats to become more radical. And so in sailing, in terms of racing, you have different classes. So you have, God, my brain's gone dead, sorry. What's it called? Where you don't, anyway, you have boats that you can't change the shape of or change the sail. And then you have boats where you can. And the boats where you can are called development classes. And basically it means that the boats change shape every couple of years, which means you have to, if you want to remain competitive, you have to get a new boat every couple of years. So it becomes kind of checkbook sailing, really. And only wealthy people can afford to do it. And that's what began to happen in Shetland as the boats developed. They moved away from traditional built boats to plywood boats built with epoxy resin glues, and sails became more expensive, masts became more expensive, until we got to the stage today where the boats still being raced. There's not that many of them, not a big class. Sailing has kind of died a death in Shetland, which is a real pity. There's lots of views why that happened. It's thought that when the oil money arrived in the 1980s, people suddenly became more wealthy, sports centres began to be built, and people had more options. I'm not sure that's a really good reason for why sailing has kind of died in Shetland. It's such a shame because Shetland's such an ideal place to go sailing. It's perfect.
It is indeed, Mark. I wonder,
So
Mark, how are things going now? Have you got more to say, or will we round it up?
No, that's it pretty much, Andrew. Sorry, I just realised that time was really galloping away. So
No, it's fine. We had some extra time, so it was good to hear all you had to say, and we can see now the excellent book on the screen. So everyone who is here, please acquire a copy, and also let your friends and colleagues know about it as well, because it's a wonderful monograph on Shetland boats, and it's something that's been needing to have been written for a long time, and it's great to see it finally out there. So, well, thank you very much indeed, Mark, for that fascinating overviews tracing the changing relationship between Norway and Shetland as far as boat and wood trade has gone on. And yeah, great photos as well that you've acquired over time. We don't really have much time for questions, but there's one here that Leslie had actually posted quite early on. So see if you have an answer for this one. So it's in the chat. So Leslie's doing an MRes at the moment, and she's interested in the shared ownership of early 16th century fishing boats on Unst, which she's found out about. And I just wondered if you had any idea how they were paid for, and family connections, and how these boats were obtained.
in the 16th century, I really don't know. In the 16th century, from sort of 19th century records that I've looked at, it seems that it's always thought that basically the fishermen rented their boats. And certainly that was the case of the large boats, the big six-oared boats, the sixons. That made no economic sense really to own a big boat that you used for, say, 3 months a year to take on that liability. It just didn't make sense. So those boats, and those boats would have been about 30 feet long overall, and they were hired. The hire charge wasn't exorbitant, but the smaller boats, it seems, were owned by families or by the crews, and sometimes you had owner skipper who owned several boats, skippered by other members of the family. So I'm guessing that would have been the same in earlier times in Shetland.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense to just to reflect back that the 19th century situation was a sort of continuation of an older way of organising things. So
yeah, I mean, even back in the 18th century as well, you know, there's orders for boats to Norway, and the tenants, landowners' tenants, were listed who wanting boats and the types of boats they wanted and the sizes. So it seems that those boats were paid for as well. Yeah, hope that's answered the question.
it certainly did. Thank you very much indeed. So I think we'll draw it to an end there. Thank you, Mark, for delivering such a great talk, and thank you everyone for your attendance. There's people writing in the chat. Thanking you for your talk, Mark. Let's hope that we're doing our bit to tell people about the importance of Shetland's boats for the cultural heritage of Shetland, and also help promote your book. And as I said, I'll try and get my boat engine fixed so that we can go out, maybe catch some fish in due course. So thank you very much indeed. And everyone else, we will be having our next Islands Matter webinar series next semester. So keep your eyes peeled for that. So thank you very much, everyone.